So this next panel is called Urgency of Collaborating to Inform Policy. And the intent is to have these three panelists. We have Melanie Bahnke, who's originally from St. Lawrence Island, from Savunga, and she's currently the president and CEO of the Kawerak Incorporated, the regional native nonprofit corporation for Bering Strait region, or for the Kawerak region, excuse me. Merritt Turetsky is from the University of Guelph. She's an ecologist and very knowledgeable of northern responses to climate change. And Gifford Wong is with the Science Technology Policy Institute. He has a background in glaciology, but he spent a lot of time working on the Hill and in other federal offices on policy. So we're going to just get started here. So most of the people here know that the Arctic environment is rapidly transforming, and that's affecting ecosystems and people. And many of the examples of what we know about it will be examined in detail in subsequent panels. In this panel, however, our goal is to highlight some of the key challenges to informing policy with knowledge. Conversely, to informing research with what policymakers need. So we hope we can identify what some of these key challenges are and ones that we can expect to come up repeatedly during conversations here at the conference. And as I said in the opening, we really are trying to create a space here in this conference where those challenges can be frankly and productively discussed. And so to accomplish that goals, we've assembled these three panelists. And I want to start with you, Melanie, because you know firsthand the pace and nature of environmental change in the Arctic. And can you speak to the urgency of responding to that change?
Yes, thank you. I have to first apologize for my voice. I came down to DC from the Arctic and got a cold. It's very ironic. I don't know why, probably the flight, the germs, who knows. You heard from some of the other folks who spoke today, and I don't want to preach too much to the choir, but in our region, which is the northern Bering Sea, we're directly experiencing climate change very rapidly. We've got 5 communities in our region that are listed as being in imminent danger due to flooding and erosion, severe fall storms. We normally have the protection of the sea ice in front of our oceans. This summer, we experienced record high temperatures, and we had fish floating in our rivers because the water temperature was just too high for the fish. We, in Alaska, have been battling wildfires. They're still continuing to battle them right now. And I could cite many more examples, but I suspect they'll come out more in our questions and answers and from the other panels and posters.
All right. Well, thanks. And I know you have a lot more you can say about it, and I know we'll have time to come back to you. But I want to bring in Merritt right now. Merritt, your research is really at the heart of environmental change. And you are quite vocal at advocating for involvement of communities in research and science and in communications, and the importance of collaboration in that regard. So as a science community, as a community of people concerned about Arctic change, where do we start?
Well, it's a great question, and I want to echo some themes that have already come out and been addressed in the fabulous talks we've already heard. I think the place to start is by, recognizing that collaborations are relationships that take time and trust and investment and probably some pretty foundational shifts in the way science gets done. But there's so many benefits to thinking about that, to doing this. You know, a lot of us in the room, myself included, you know, we spent a lot of time thinking about, you know, how can we use all of these public funds to support science without really considering societal relevance. But we can get there faster, and I think we can get there better than we have been doing if we work really closely with communities, if we work very closely with a variety of stakeholders, and actually build our science around those needs. So not a science to policy pipeline, not a one-way flow of information that is the old model, but a new model where engagement is really front and center. And I think if we're going to achieve that, we really need to walk in with a holistic perspective. I think, you know, as we've been hearing, a reductionist lens is just going to really fall short. In a lot of the communities that I work with, you know, everything is connected, and we see that those connections in the very definition that was presented to us today on Indigenous knowledge. And so for me, you know, working with communities and being embraced by those connections has really forced me at times to move out of my own comfort zone, but that's where progress occurs. And, you know, I know for myself that I am a better scholar as a result of that kind of work. And there's a lot of reasons why this is going to lead to improved science as well. Again, these are going to come out over the next panels and talks, but you know, by working with local knowledge holders, we can do better downscaling of global climate. We can verify those trends. We can improve our accuracy. Working with Indigenous and traditional knowledge holders, of course, helps place our modern observations in that context of historical change. That came up again today also, and is so, so important. And so, Melanie, I know you think about this a lot because we've talked about the need for scientists and policymakers to work with tribal councils, to kind of develop and work with community protocols. Can you offer some thoughts on sort of this new model?
Thank you, Merritt. I'm glad you brought in the topic of trust, because I think in order to move forward in a positive way, the scientific community and the governmental community, the policymakers, need to recognize and understand that scientists and policymakers haven't always had the best relationship with Indigenous communities. That trust needs to be rebuilt. There needs to be respect. Scientists and policymakers both need to understand that we are living and not just seeing and reporting these rapid changes. We're part of the ecosystem. We're not just users of the ecosystem. When there's a ripple effect, we feel it before you can detect it. I also think that traditional and scientific knowledge holders should be viewed as on par with each other, if not viewing the traditional knowledge holders at an even higher level, because like I said, we're part of the ecosystem, not just users or observers of it. We're not looking at things under a microscope or in a petri dish. We're definitely very much alive and part of the ecosystem. One of the challenges has been the fact that we have management regimes that seek to obtain information from traditional knowledge holders and scientists, but the challenge that we've been facing is asserting that we should be part of those co-management decision-making bodies. The Arctic Council, for example, has 8 nation states, but we're relegated to observer status on these decision-making forums. So I think that's been a real challenge for us. I'm glad you brought up trust. That needs to be acknowledged and recognized if we're going to move forward in a positive way, where we marry scientific knowledge, traditional knowledge, to inform policy and to also include people in the Arctic in the policy making that affects the Arctic. Gifford, we were talking right before we came up here about political whims that impact policy, and the challenge for both scientists and the Indigenous community to try to inform decision makers.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Melanie. And you know, one of the themes that was touched upon in the earlier session, perhaps, was this idea of consistency. I think that even as Senator Murkowski sort of brought up that, you know, we're trying to listen to all of the voices, because like you said, climate change will affect all of us. no matter where we live or who we voted for, its effects will be felt nearly everywhere across the U.S., right? And we're talking about the very obvious sort of like reported in the news sea level rise to some of the less reported, say, changes in seasonal precipitation that will affect mountain snowpacks. I think that when trying to think about how policy can engage on the issue of climate change through the lens of trust, you have to think about the consistency issue. And maybe like there are definite examples of where we have been inconsistent. I think, if you think about the public press, right, the president's 2017 announcement of his intention to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement can be an example of where we may have been inconsistent and not taking into consideration what science has been talking about, or traditional knowledge holders, or even the American public. More recently, there's the disagreement between automakers and maybe the EPA's plan to weaken tailpipe emission standards. But then you see California and the other Section 177 states working with a handful of automakers to try and at least maintain the strength of the existing policies. And to the point made earlier that policymakers are trying to pay attention to this, I think there are still sort of standing and active examples of where this might be happening, like the House Climate Solutions Caucus. It's a caucus that is a space, or a safe space rather, where representatives on both sides of the aisle can sort of hash out and talk about climate issues. And this Congress, the co-chairs, Representatives Deutsch and Rooney, both from Florida, Democrat and Republican, introduced the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And last month, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, they unanimously approved the Americans Transportation Infrastructure Act, the first transportation bill to acknowledge and recognize and sort of act on climate change to the tune of $10 billion, and I've heard about 100 pages of bill text. So I guess, to sum up, there's definitely an audience, certainly within the policymaker space, to try and bring all of this together to work on addressing climate change. But maybe from my perspective, certainly as the news reports it, the actions have been inconsistent.
Well, to follow up on that, we heard Senator Murkowski say that that future Arctic policy needs to be informed by the knowledge and vision of Indigenous peoples and scientists, as well as policymakers. So the question is, so what's in the way? What's challenging informing policy with knowledge? Merritt, let's start with you as a scientist who's worked in both Alaska and Canada. What do you see what's in the way of getting this information together, these voices talking to one another?
I mean, we can probably all agree that we're limited by some common themes, time, funding, probably all have that in common. But I think there's some deeper challenges that we can explore together as a group. This kind of collaborative work, in my opinion, is really stressful, even when things are going well. I no longer work just with data, I work with people. And I work with things that people cherish the most and treasure and hold dear to them. And so there's a fragility to that you just don't get by working in the biophysical arenas. And I think we need to acknowledge that the science can be going really well. We can be hitting all our milestones and feeling great, even while the communities are suffering. And that's really profound to me. Things are definitely getting more difficult and more challenging for people living in the North. And, as a scientist, I'm helping those communities to study that. But that's not enough. We need to feel those changes. We need to experience those challenges and that pain right alongside them. And that takes empathy. And empathy is difficult. It's not really a skill that most scientists have in their traditional scientific toolbox. And so I think that's a big challenge. You know, I mentioned that relationships are built on trust, but they're also built on giving and taking. You know, we can't collaborate with communities or policymakers or any stakeholders and only take. We also need to give back. But it raises this question for me, you know, what is the right level of sharing and openness? And, you know, I struggle with this at times. And I think the answer to that question probably depends on a lot of specific situations and conditions, but I do know that if scientists or anyone doing this kind of work only takes, you know, that's what leads to community fatigue. And I personally feel like that's what leads to shallow science. But when we can find that right balance of giving and taking, of trust building, you know, these collaborations can be very real, they can be very meaningful, and they can actually lead to healing. And the challenges, I think, also rise to an institutional level. We absolutely need to demand leadership. We need to carve out space for institutional change. Again, from my scientific perspective, you know, scientists continue to be rewarded almost exclusively on peer-reviewed publications. But if we want our impact to be felt broadly and to be real, you know, we really need to change that. We need to provide incentives and training for other types of knowledge co-production, recognition of other types of knowledge platforms. You know, a recent study showed that scientists who are involved in this type of engaged scholarship and research are definitely not rewarded for their activities. They're actually punished by the scientific system. So that's a challenge that has to change. So all of this comes from, you know, my very scientific perspective. Melanie, I know you'll have different thoughts from a traditional knowledge space.
Yes, I think, you know, we've been throwing around the terms indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge as though they're interchangeable, but in my region, in my community, we differentiate even between indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, because indigenous knowledge implies it's knowledge held by any indigenous person. But for us, traditional knowledge is that which has been passed on for thousands of years, that knowledge of the ice, the environment, how we interact with the marine mammals around us, how much to take. That is traditional knowledge that's been passed down. I think traditional knowledge, like I said earlier, it needs to be viewed as superior and on par with modern science. You can't have science being conducted in a lab down in California on the Arctic. You actually need to be informed by on the ground, boots on the ground, people observing and living in the environment. We have had instances where policymakers refuse to value traditional knowledge on par without scientific data to back it up. I remember hearing about one of our communities, Munalcleet, where the local hunters were insisting that the bag limit on moose be reduced because they were concerned about the moose population and they felt it was in decline. Our state Fish and Game Management entity said that they didn't have the resources to conduct an aerial moose survey, and without that, they couldn't justify reducing the bag limit. That's an example of policymakers not recognizing traditional knowledge on par. The local hunters ended up imposing a moratorium on themselves until that population rebounded. So traditional knowledge and its value needs to be afforded resources. We're often competing with very well-heeled institutions, like you mentioned, who want to engage with us as partners, but not necessarily have us as the co-lead investigators. The ivory bans that are being enacted by various states is an example of policy, and this is ivory bans on walrus. Policymakers not being informed by either scientists or the traditional knowledge holders. The science shows that our Pacific walrus population is healthy, and yet we've got 5 states set where I wouldn't be able to wear this because there's a ban on walrus ivory. So definitely when you're not using both scientific data and traditional knowledge to inform the policies, bad decisions are made. And I'd like to go even further to say that not only should we be informing policy, we should be at the decision-making table and practicing co-management. That's my vision for how it would work out, is not just asking us what we think, but actually us being able to guide and make the policies, and that scientists would recognize that their work is inferior without our information and our knowledge.
Thank you. So Gifford, your background is both in science, you have a doctorate in glaciology, and you have considerable experience working in the policy realm. Are these challenges that Melanie and Merritt just outlined, are they visible in the policy world?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a word, yes. Absolutely, they're visible in the world here in DC. I think just as a short aside, like, you know, the challenge of getting everyone either at the table or to be able to hear everyone's voices, I believe that's, you know, something else that Senator Murkowski's address mentioned with regards to trying to incorporate all of that input, the input of the constituents, the scientists, the indigenous peoples that are living there, like boots on the ground, as well as like the other think tanks and nonprofits that are also sort of, you know, looking in these areas. And so I think that, you know, that's a space where offices want to try and make themselves more accessible, and the challenge then is to try and incorporate a response or a solution that can please everyone. And I suppose there is that saying that it's really hard to please everyone, but political compromise is an unfortunate necessity. And so trying to work out strategies so that the compromise is as equitable as possible, that would definitely be one challenge that I see sort of echoed, at least, you know, here and in the time that I've been in DC. I think Merritt mentioned sort of time and the scales of time, and science is a very step-by-step process, and it embraces variability, variation, and uncertainty. And certainly, if you ask my advisor, it seems to never finish. So it takes a long time. Traditional knowledge took thousands of years to build up and you know, create this very strong body of knowledge system. And I think sometimes Hill offices just work on very improbable, quick turn time schedules, where when you have the sort of right conditions for, say, a policy to come into effect, then they kind of quickly reach out and say, where can I get this knowledge that I need? Because I need it right now. And so trying to make those tempos fit together well. And I'm certainly interested to see how this mismatch in tempos between science and policymaking sort of play out in the other panels. And then I think to a point that Merritt had raised with regards to, you know, working with people and how it's relational, I definitely certainly see that on the Hill as well. Sometimes it's just that random acquaintance you met at a happy hour, but they also happen to be a staffer in that across the aisle office that enables then for the key co-sponsorship of a bill or something. So, oh yeah, right. No, I think relationships though, you know, work out in all of these circles, right? You know, where like you can have that great science project, or you can have just great interactions that sort of enable things to happen.
Yeah, I'm really tempted to jump in on this question of relationships, and I'd like to come back to that, and specifically with reference to the rate of turnover in the policy world. But let's put a pin in that. I ask you to kind of respond to Merritt and Melanie. I just want to give you a chance, Gifford, to say, tell us if there are challenges you have observed as a scientist or a policymaker, other than the ones that have been outlined so far.
You know, excuse me. No, I wish there were some new challenges. I think the challenges that have already been presented are probably some of the main challenges that I've seen. Certainly when I was going through my PhD, so maybe in that scientist hat role, I felt that there's really a huge need for institutional change. Not just this idea of rewarding academics for, say, informing policy, but that larger conversation of inclusivity, diversity, equity, such that we're bringing more voices to the table, right? We're able to partner, engage with traditional knowledge holders, as well as like just incorporating even different science disciplines to examine this sort of problem or challenge that we have with regards to climate change. Like how do people make decisions? It's something I didn't study, but I know someone did. And so partnering with them might make the write-up of said science more accessible. And then I guess just like, working in DC, I feel that I'm talking a lot more than I should. I feel like DC is all about succinct and how do you make messages very bite-sized so that it's very quick, but processable and accessible. And so the challenge of trying to communicate, this is a very complex issue. And watching environmental change in the Arctic can be very complex and involves different voices, traditional knowledge holders and science folks, as well as like people who have had a history playing in the policy space. And so I see that, I guess, as another challenge that sort of echoes what they've said more than being something different.
I'm not letting you off the hook that easy.
Okay, that's fair.
I'm sorry, but so you're a scientist, you're a policymaker, you know a lot about the Arctic. I hear agreement here that we need policy being informed by traditional knowledge and by scientific knowledge. We talked about in the previous panel the urgency question, and it's going to come up again and again. You're on the hook, man. Tell us how we're going to bring this together. How are we going to step up and more effectively inform policy with what we know?
Well, I don't think I'll be able to disprove you on stage. I wasn't like holding back. I think there were very informed speakers before this panel, and that's one of the questions that this conference was meant to try and work towards answering, right? Is bringing these voices under this angular auditorium-like tent to begin to build these partnerships, these relationships, and to be able to talk through this very pressing challenge. It does require all of us to participate, scientists and traditional knowledge holders and policymakers, both from like the local level to the federal and even international stage. And it might become a little uncomfortable. But that's how you move things forward, and that's where we need to play. So I certainly thank you for the opportunity to try and disprove you, but more importantly, this conference is meant to help answer that question.
Okay, I'm going to let you off the hook, but I'm just going to pass it on to Melanie then and say, okay, Melanie, you got to tell us, particularly from a traditional knowledge policy interface perspective, what do we need to do to improve that pipeline of information to policymakers? We heard the senator say she really appreciates it, she depends on it. But I also hear you saying it's not working in a lot of contexts.
We are making some progress. The Coast Guard sought input on a port access route study to come up with the best path through the Northwest Passage. And through efforts of our Marine program, Austin Amasuk, who you'll hear from later on, he was able to gather knowledge from our hunters to inform the Coast Guard on what areas should be strictly avoided that were very highly sensitive marine areas, and the Coast Guard took that information and adjusted their route. I think it was last year or the year before, we had a NOAA research vessel near St. Lawrence Island, near Gamble, and it was interfering with the spring walrus hunt. And so we made contact with NOAA and asked them to stand down. And the initial response that we got was, well, this research that we're doing is good for you. It's going to help you. Meanwhile, we're trying to fill our freezers with food for the winter. Because of that, NOAA is now seeking our input in terms of how best they can engage in tribal consultation. We've informed them that they should be working with our communities if they're going to be in the area before they even make plans to travel out in terms of what's the best time. There should be Indigenous people part of that research process. I saw a meme. It was actually on Facebook on one of those native humor sites, and it shows this lady with 50 microphones and then this one guy with one little microphone over here. And it said something like scientists, and it could also be policymakers though, so don't take offense to scientists. Scientists who have studied the Arctic, and then the person with the one microphone was person who lives in the Arctic. But it could also be said for policymakers. I do think the challenge is that traditional knowledge needs to be valued in the first place, and decisions can't be made like port access route study where major shipping lanes should be directed without involvement by the people who live in the Arctic. So I think, the port access route study is an example of one positive where the government actually engaged with and sought out some input. It was not an easy process at first. They just initially came up with their draft and said, here's the route that we recommend. And we said, whoa. This is right in our front yard. You can't just create a route without talking to people who live in this environment. I think this conference is a good first step. I was just talking to some of my Indigenous colleagues here, and we were noting that it seems like pretty much every single panel has at least one Indigenous person speaking, and I'm grateful for that. I think it's progress, but like I said, I'd like to get us to the point where we're beyond consultation, cooperation, informing policymakers. I'd like us to actually be part of the decision-making process.
All right. Well, I don't want to let Merritt off too easy. So I just want to ask you, before we go to Q&A, to elaborate a little bit about you've been made the case that your science was better for working in communities, that you advocate for this. So how would you sort of add some vocabulary to this conference to carry that forward so that the traditional knowledge, science, policy collaborations start to feel real and not like just add-ons?
I think for many scientists, this is all really new. The ground is sort of shifting in how we do our science. And it's exciting, but I think it can be really scary because it involves people. The stakes are high. We're working with people. We're working with their resources side by side. And even when things are going well, communication breakdowns happen all the time. And sometimes this is over words or jargon. We heard early this morning, like language really matters. And terms today like resilience, subsistence, these are now politicized words, and yet they're still part of our lexicon. We need to be careful in how we use them. And I think sometimes communication breakdowns are happening because of some false dichotomies that we hold within the scientific community, that maybe this type of work is going to push us too close to activism, or maybe we'll lose some of our rigor or our objectivity by working in close collaboration with these partners. And I just think more experience, more collaboration, more time, more trust, bringing in the social scientists, which we haven't really talked about so much on this panel, but is really important, will break down those false notions. And so I'm very hopeful. There's a word that has been used several times today that is a very uncomfortable truth for scientists, and that word is colonial. Especially scientists working in the North, we need to come to terms with the history, the colonial history of science, and we need to move that ship in a new direction. We need to change that. I was on a stage just like this a few years ago. I shared that stage with Shilawat Cloutier, who is an Inuit diplomat in Canada and an author. And she used an analogy that just struck me right through the heart, and I can't shake it. It's the analogy is that she compared researchers, scientists coming to her community to snow geese. They show up like a flock every year, very predictably, at the same time. They take things from the land, they take what they need, and then they leave, just like snow geese. And sometimes they leave that land ravaged. And that is a legacy that I am not proud of. We need to change that legacy, and we need to change that now. So I think more terms, humble. Scientists need to be humbled and in awe in the face of, working with traditional knowledge holders. And I think we need to be really open to building new skills that we don't talk a lot about. Conflict resolution, trust building, these are all skills that are relational skills, and I think that's going to be an important part of our science moving forward. And my last word, you mentioned it, and I had to repeat it, is grateful. I am so grateful that these communities that I work with allow me in and allow me to work on their land. I'm grateful for everything I've learned from them, and just really grateful for those partners, and also grateful to have this space here. I think it's a great way to kick things off. So, thanks.
Thanks. It's not surprising that you all have a lot of questions. That's a good thing. But I want to kind of pick up with your last comments here, and it's a question for Melanie, and it kind of plays off of the snow geese, I think. And the question is this: it says there is a lot of Arctic.
Can I say something about that really quickly? At least the snow geese provide us some kind of sustenance.
Oh,
That was the part. That was the part of the analogy
It's a little bit of a reciprocal
that really
relationship
struck
there.
me in the heart. Yeah, exactly. Right.
good. I won't be worried about sleeping in the tundra knowing that some hunter is coming.
They actually provide us something in return.
Yes.
Well, the question, though, is there is a lot of Arctic research. How best to involve the people who live in the Arctic without overwhelming them with requests? So this snow geese come in big flocks, and so do scientists.
We're seeing it because, there's so many different universities in the U.S. and in the international community, and everybody wants to take part in Arctic research, and it's not necessarily coordinated. People aren't talking to one another. Our communities are getting overwhelmed, and I think there needs to be better coordination from the onset and engaging us in what we feel should be researched and what's worthy of research, and respecting local protocols. Don't expect to just go into a community and be able to conduct research without working with the tribal council, without working with the regional organizations that are very involved in their communities. I also think that some of the more urgent things that we're experiencing are going not necessarily, they're just not being researched enough or communicated enough to the policymakers, because we have, and my father-in-law has a cabin, and across the road he leases some land to some research outfit, and they're studying mice and the impact of climate change on mice. I'm not exactly sure what they're studying. In the meantime, we've got communities that are being flooded, and nobody's researching what kinds of seawalls to build, what kinds of protection to put in place, infrastructure to put in place in this rapidly changing Arctic community, and yet mice are being studied. So I think the first step is to ask us what we feel is important immediately to be researched. There's of course global interest in the Arctic and climate change, but at a very local level, we're experiencing life-threatening results of climate change, and there's not much discussion about that.
Yeah, I think that is something we all have to sort of struggle with, is what is the right balance between the basic research that needs to happen so you can detect something like climate change in the first place, but then the very real, you're talking about lives being lost, we're hearing about real impacts. I think this is something we collectively have to grapple with. I want to turn it to the science policy interface for a moment, although I think it applies to the Indigenous information as well. And this is a question from one of my colleagues who shall remain nameless, but his initials are Ted Schur. And he wants to...
Ted.
He asks, what is the approach for developing policy when many science issues can only provide relatively wide ranges for possible futures? Gifford?
What is the approach to policy?
Yeah, so I think what he's asking is, how do you develop policy when you ask how much methane, for example, is going to come out of the tundra, and Merritt and Ted and their colleagues are giving you very wide ranges? How do you work with that? What do we do about that?
Well, I mean, I think that's definitely one of the challenges, and we're talking about timescales, and the first three speakers sort of talked about timescales from millions of years, thousands, and today, and it unfortunately sometimes depends maybe on how far out maybe the office is looking or the agency or department is looking. You'd like to think that there is long-term planning, and there is, but sometimes, and you've seen this reported in public press, like sometimes the outlook may be only as far as the next election. So you're working between the bounds of 1 to 2 years to 5 and tens of years. I think the other aspect of how policy can take in information with such wide bounds is that idea of, like I heard this in like an orientation about like policy, politics, and procedure, whereby the policy may be well informed by the science and the traditional knowledge that may have these sort of large uncertainties or variability. And then it depends on the politics of, say, those bounds or the procedure. How do you marry up the science with maybe some of the studies that look at the economics or the challenges of building out infrastructure and where you find revenue, which are issues that I've sort of watched from afar, but maybe not, can't speak to specifics like it's probably case by case because it depends on the office. But that's really hard, Ted. So, yeah.
Sorry, Ted, that's the best I could do. So did you have something on that, or?
Well, I was just going to, I think scientists can also, build better bridges for that policy assimilation. And I think many of us are getting a little bit more skilled in scenario planning, risk assessments, but also storytelling. Science in storytelling narratives, I think also connects really well with policymakers and what policymakers can then go on to tell. And so I think those are all skills that we're hopefully getting better at.
Yeah, but it does strike me we're still struggle with the fact that we're trained as scientists to look for a confidence level that'll get us published. We're not trained to say we don't need 95% confidence. If the best available information tells us that this village is going to be flooded out, 60% is good enough for a policy, I would think. And so being comfortable to say what we know and what we don't know without making it sound like we don't know anything. I want to just real quickly come back to this pin I put in earlier, because you all made a good case, I think, for relationships being really important if we're going to collaborate across policymaking, indigenous communities, and science. One of the things that was very striking to me when I worked here in DC in the policy world was how short the tenure was of anybody working on an issue in Arctic or anything else for that matter. Relative to the decades I spent in Alaska, I still interact with people I've known in Alaska for decades. And so what I noticed was whether we agreed on things or not, that we knew each other, there was a relationship, we could sit down and talk about it. I don't know that I have a question here, but I do have a suggestion that all of us should be thinking about, I think, which is that if you don't recognize that that's going on, then you could be very well set up to be really frustrated, right? Because you will have to go back and brief again and again and again and again. And at some point, I think, Melanie, you experienced this probably, within Alaska, there are people that you've known for a long time, you interact, you don't agree with them all, they don't all agree with you, but you know where they're coming from and you have an ongoing conversation. But you come to the federal level and it's constantly a new, even within an administration without a change of administrations. That's something we collectively, I think, need to deal with. We've used up our time. Thank you very much for your thoughtful comments, and thank you for your very good questions.